Welcome to the Retirement Made Easy podcast. I'm your host, Greg Gonzalez. My goal for the podcast is to help you live a better life in retirement by giving you the tools and information you need in a language that you can understand. On today's episode, I wanted to talk about 5 life lessons that I have learned from clients over the years after I got to understand their situation and maybe mistakes they made or circumstances that occurred in their life. On today's episode, we'll stick with the top 5 lessons that I have learned from folks over the years. But truth be told, I have learned probably dozens and dozens of life lessons over the years just by getting to know people, whether it's clients or people who didn't end up becoming clients. I had the opportunity to learn from them based on their experiences, mistakes they made, successes that they experienced that I can share with others. I think this information will be very beneficial to everyone out there and even get you thinking about your own situation and maybe things to avoid or things to capitalize on. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to remind listeners to check out our website, which is retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. That's retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. While you're there, you can listen to previous episodes. You can also download my free resources, such as my retirement secret sauce, which is awesome, and maybe our 2020 free tax planning guide. So check those out. Our website again, retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. Today, I want to talk about 5 life lessons, I guess financial life lessons that I've learned from people over the years, many of which are clients of mine or previous clients of mine, and some of them were just people in passing that I was able to learn from. The first lesson I wanted to talk about today was when it comes to loaning money to people. I have seen this mistake over and over again. I have heard more stories about people getting burnt when they loan money to a friend or a family member. It could be a son or daughter or a son-in-law or an uncle, whoever it is. I have heard countless stories of personal loans to people to either start a business or some kind of venture. It might be an investment opportunity. So I want to warn people, be very, very cautious, be very careful when it comes to loaning money to people. I had an instance where a gentleman was in his 70s and he loaned his best friend's son money for a real estate investment opportunity in Colorado. And of course, it was a big loan. If I recall correctly, it was somewhere north of $200,000. And of course, what happened was he gave his best friend's son the $200,000, wrote him the check, and he was going to get interest payments, or so he was told, within 60 days. He would start receiving interest payments from his best friend's son. What happened turned out the best friend's son moved out to Colorado and he stopped answering his phone. So this 70-plus-year-old man was out basically over $200,000. But he was convinced. He said, I knew this young man growing up. My son went to school with him. I trust that I'm going to get my money back. And I asked him, I said, what would happen if you don't? And he said, well, my retirement would be absolutely crushed. It would be ruined. I put my full trust in this young man, and he was so convincing that this real estate opportunity was going to be lights out. It was a no-brainer. It was a perfect investment. And I trusted him. The last I heard from him was the best friend's son was still not returning any of his calls. In fact, wasn't talking to his father anymore either. And this gentleman that I had met never received one interest payment from his $200,000+ loan to this young man. So, word of caution, be extremely careful and cautious when it comes to loaning money to people. I look at loaning money to people kind of like if your neighbor came over and asked to use a shovel. You're going to give him or her the shovel you got to picture that you're never going to receive it back again. It's never going to be returned to you. Or if you do get it back, you have to assume that it might be damaged. or not in the same condition that you loaned it out as. It's the same thing with money. I only advise loaning out money in an amount that wouldn't devastate you financially. In other words, if you never received a dime of the loan back, you may be bitter, you may be heartbroken, but it wouldn't ruin you financially like it did this gentleman. When I talked to him 6 months later after he loaned out the money, I think he was pretty naive and he was still convinced that he was going to get back his money at some point. But I don't know how that story ended, but I'm convinced he'll never see a dime of that loan back. Moral of the story, loaning money to people can ruin relationships and is generally a very bad idea. So be very cautious, and if you can avoid it, avoid it. Also, if you must make the loan, the personal loan to somebody, I would recommend having an attorney or a CPA draft up a loan document. Both you, the loaner, and the borrower, which is called the loanee, will sign the document. You would ideally have it notarized and have witnesses there. That would be my best advice for getting documentation for the loan. The loan document is also going to have the repayment terms all spelled out, and that's where a CPA can be very, very valuable in drafting up that document. It may go without saying, but I've also seen a lot of people get themselves into trouble when co-signing for a loan for someone else. So be careful there. It's the same as loaning somebody money. The next life lesson that I have learned from clients and just people over the years is really planning for the unthinkable or the unexpected. I've been a financial advisor for over a decade now, and during that period, unfortunately, I have had clients pass away completely out of the blue. It was very, very sad. I can think of one instance in particular. A gentleman was divorced. He was a client of mine, and he left his son and daughter, who were in their early 20s, over $500,000 each. He had a heart attack and passed away completely unexpectedly, and his two heirs were his son and daughter in their early 20s. And if you have children in their early 20s, or maybe they're older now, and at one point they were in their early 20s, at the point maybe they're getting their first job, maybe they have student loans, they may not be the most financially responsible at that age. And that applied to this client in particular. His daughter was very financially responsible, very financially astute, but her younger brother, complete opposite. So when they each inherited north of $500,000 each, it was from this client's 401k plan. So it was all tax-deferred money, meaning taxes had not yet been paid. So as the son and daughter in their early 20s took withdrawals from their inherited IRA, is what it turned out to be, they had to pay taxes on every dollar that they withdrew. Now take a step back and think about that. Imagine a 22-year-old young man inheriting $500,000 in an IRA. What's on his mind at 22 years old? Probably a fast car, maybe a boat, maybe he's thinking about getting a house, maybe vacations. Well, that's exactly what I experienced with this young man. The first thing he did was he went out and bought the fastest sports car that he could find. It was around $65,000, $70,000. As his inherited financial advisor, or I was the financial advisor of his father, I told him, hey, this money's not going to last forever if you spend through it like this. Well, I think my advice went right over his head. He ended up buying a boat, gambling a bunch away. I think he may have got into the opiates addiction. But what I can tell you is within 18 months, that $500,000 was gone. And so what that means is he paid the taxes on that entire $500,000 inherited IRA. And I think he ended up owing the IRS a lot of money because he didn't withhold enough for taxes. And I kept thinking about his father. His father worked for 35 years and saved and invested for all that time. And at the end of the day, after he passed away, his life savings that he worked so hard for were squandered away within 18 months because his son wanted a fast car and a fast boat and wanted to gamble it away. On the other hand, the good news is his daughter was very financially responsible, and the money she inherited has been a blessing for her and her family. So the lesson here is, if you're going to name your 20-year-old or 22-year-old children as beneficiaries of your life savings, make sure that they're at the point in their life where they're going to be financially responsible with it. And if not, maybe you want to put a trust in place or some other stipulations where they may not be able to use the money to ruin their life. So especially when it's a substantial amount of money, as I just mentioned, $1 million split two ways is $500,000 each. That's a lot of money. It can do a lot of good for them if smart decisions are made, but it really can almost ruin their lives if bad decisions are made. The next lesson that I have learned throughout the years from clients and people is don't step over $5 bills to pick up a nickel. I could give countless examples of this in stories. I'll share a few here, but a lot of times people are trying to save money, but they're not looking at the big picture. One time I was talking to a lady about her simple IRA through work, and she said she didn't like the simple IRA through work and didn't contribute to it anymore because the costs were so high with the simple IRA. And I said, well, how much does it cost? She said it cost $50 a year for the annual fee. And I said, okay, the match in your simple IRA is 3%, meaning if you put in 3%, they match it dollar for dollar with 3%. So I said, it's going to cost you $50 a year to have your simple IRA, and you make $50,000, that's your salary. So 3% of $50,000, the match is $1,500 a year. And so what she was doing is she was looking at the cost, the $50, but she wasn't looking at the benefit, which is $1,500, which a match in a simple IRA is always 100% vested day one. That's a huge advantage of simple IRAs. So if she puts in $1,500, her company matches $1,500, that's a 100% rate of return on your money. And it only cost her $50 a year. So really, the benefit there is $1,450. It wasn't because the expense is $50. So again, she was looking at the nickel there and not looking at the $5 bill. One more extreme example was a listener of a radio show I had in St. Louis about 5 or 6 years ago. I had it for many, many years, but I spoke with a gentleman who had done really, really well for himself over the years, and he had accumulated a nest egg of $3 million. Did quite well, and he was very proud. But we always ask people, what are your goals as far as retirement? And his number one goal, and I'll never forget this, he said he didn't want to pay any taxes on his Social Security benefit. And he was of the opinion that his $3 million, which was outside of IRAs, by the way, it was in a brokerage account, he did not want that money to earn any interest or any dividends because that might cause him, in his opinion, to pay taxes on his Social Security. So what he was telling me was he didn't want the $3 million to ever grow at all. Those were the words out of his mouth. And I was absolutely floored. That is like telling your boss, I don't want to work overtime because I'll get time and a half and I'll just have to pay too much in taxes. Yeah, but you're getting time and a half for the same work. It's not any extra. You're getting 50% more pay. It just didn't make sense to me. Be careful when you're trying to save money, whether it be on taxes or just expenses. You don't want to step over $5 bills to pick up a nickel. Remember, good things aren't cheap and cheap things aren't good. There are no bargains in toilet paper, life preservers, heart surgery, or parachutes. If you try to go the cheap route every time, it might end up being the most expensive lesson you'll ever learn. I knew of a gentleman who was trying to save money on his will. And he said, I don't want to pay an attorney, an estate attorney, to help me write my will and do it the right way, which is the expensive way. I will just write it on a yellow legal pad, and I'll write it very neatly, and I'll have the date on there and everything. Well, it turns out in his state, his state does not accept a handwritten will. So it was thrown out in probate court and ended up costing his family a lot of heartache, a lot of money to get it all straightened out. And still, his legacy was tarnished because his true wishes were never carried out per his handwritten will, all to save a couple bucks from the expense of a state attorney. Most estate attorneys around here, couple $100 and your will's going to be good to go. The next lesson that I have learned, I guess the life lesson that I've learned from people over the years, is be careful how you title assets, whether it be real estate or maybe a checking or a bank account. I'll give a perfect example out there. My grandfather was a medic in the Korean War. And when he got over to Korea, he had the Red Cross on his helmet and he had the cross armband on his shoulder, and they gave him a pistol to wear around his waist. And he was standing in line over there, and there was a gentleman, another soldier, who was sitting on a log smoking a cigarette, and he was just laughing at him. And he said, "What are you laughing at me for?" And the soldier said, "You're our new medic, huh?" And he goes, "Yeah, my name's Frank." And he said, "You haven't heard the story of the last half a dozen medics that we've had, have you?" And he said, "No, well, what happened to them?" And he said, "Buddy, you got the most dangerous job out here." He said, "When the Koreans see you on the battlefield and they see that red cross, you're the first one that they shoot at." And my grandfather's eyes got real big. And he said, "Well, what should I do?" He said, "If I were you, I would rub mud all over that red cross, take off that armband, and I would get rid of that pistol, and I would carry a rifle like the rest of us." So that's exactly what my grandfather did. And that guy smoking the cigarette on that log that day, that soldier, ended up becoming one of my grandfather's best friends. And it turned out back in the United States, they grew up within an hour of each other in Illinois. So they became good fishing buddies and they hunted together throughout the years. And that gentleman's name was Perry. He was the soldier sitting on the log smoking the cigarette. And Perry made one of the biggest mistakes of his life. He had one son, and he ended up inheriting a lot of farm ground and ended up buying some farm ground from the neighbors. And he was in his 70s, and he had about 500 acres of land in Illinois. And he thought, when I die, I want my only son to inherit all these farms, this farm ground. Most of his net worth, most of his assets were tied up in that farm ground. Well, guess what happened? Years later, his son ended up getting divorced. And what happened is, technically, his son owned 50% of that 500 acres of farm ground, and it had really increased in value over the years. So as the divorce got settled, they ended up having to auction off the entire 500 acres of farm ground. And at the end of the day, Perry ended up with about 120 acres of his original 500-acre farm. It ended up costing him literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he was in tears over it until the day he died. So the lesson here is be very, very careful when you're putting someone's name to be a joint owner on any asset, whether it's real estate like Perry's case, or maybe it's a checking account or bank account. If it's a sizable amount of money, if something happened to the person you are naming as the joint owner, let's say you put your son or daughter's name on your bank accounts or your real estate. If they get in a lawsuit, they get sued, they get in a car accident and get sued, they get divorced, and they are listed as a joint owner on those assets are going to go into the lawsuit, and you may end up losing half of them. Or think about creditors. Let's say you name your son or daughter as a joint owner, and creditors are coming after them. Those creditors are going to look at those assets that they have. Again, they would be owned 50-50 with you, and they would be subject to the creditors coming after them. So be very, very careful when you're adding someone's name to your property, to your assets, because they will be a joint owner, and you really open yourself up to a lot of risk. And yeah, I understand if titled correctly and there isn't a lawsuit, there's not a divorce, there's nothing like that, it can be an acceptable way to get the money to children or the next generation and avoid probate. But you've just got to understand the risks associated with naming someone as a joint owner of your assets. The next lesson that I have learned from folks and clients over the years is to teach your kids and grandkids how to save. However you do it, there's a lot of great books out there. Dave Ramsey and Rachel Cruz have some great books on teaching kids how to be good with money at an early age. And we really have to instill in our kids and our grandkids the value of saving money. And the best way I know how to do this is to share examples of people and stories that I've heard and experienced. And in all the years that I've been meeting with people that are planning for retirement, I've never heard them all say one thing. And that one thing is, I've never heard anyone say, man, I wish I wouldn't have saved so much money for retirement. Never, not once has anyone said that. They all say, gosh, I wish we would have been able to save more, so we'd be more confident about our retirement. I guess until you've met that person that's in their 70s or 80s and has run through their retirement savings. In other words, they got nothing in the bank, no retirement savings, and they're living purely on Social Security. Imagine that person and the hurt and the pain in their voice. Until you've had a conversation with that person, you will never truly know how important it is to save for the future. I can tell you from personal experience, while I was doing my radio show in St. Louis, I met with dozens of people that fit that very description. They were living purely on Social Security because they had no other financial resources. And I felt so bad for those people, so much pity for those people. And they all said the same thing. I wish I could go back to when I was 20 or 30 years old and I would have started saving more and more money for retirement. If I just would have saved more, I wouldn't be in the situation I'm in right now. So what I'm trying to get across is, hopefully, hearing this story will encourage you to have a conversation with your kids and your grandkids and show them the value of saving money for the future and investing money for the future so they don't end up at any point being in that situation like those folks that I have met throughout the years. Remember, money is just a tool, but it gives you choices in life. It gives you the ability to have financial independence and dignity. I hope today's talk has been valuable for you and you've been able to hopefully learn or pick up some ideas of life lessons, life financial lessons that I have personally learned from people over the years, and hopefully I can pass them on to you. So thank you for joining me today. I want to mention before I go, check out the podcast website, which is retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. While you're there, you can check out previous episodes as well as download things such as my retirement secret sauce or our 2020 tax guide. So check that out, retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. Thanks for listening today, and remember, always dream big. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, please consult your attorney, financial advisor, or tax advisor prior to investing. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor, member of FINRA, SIPC.